We're continuing now on Daf Pei Ches. I would say we're about maybe 1/3 of the way down, right below Tosus Divra Maskal Masnisin. And you'll see that the line starts with the words Omar Rabbi Zera, and we're up to Tana Rabban. And somebody asked me about the Gemara that we skipped. It's all Agadata. And right now, B'mechila, I'm not so much in the mood for Agadata. I'll get to that in Daf Yomi. If anybody wants to hear the recording or join me in Daf Yomi, you're certainly invited. But for us, we want to do more of an BIyun job, and therefore I'm skipping the Agadata, and we're focusing on the issue of various members of the household and who has the authority to determine what Korban Pesach they will eat from, what Chabura they are part of. We discussed the case of a married woman who's sort of in a tug of war between her husband and her father. We discussed the case of a Yasam who's in a tug of war between two apotropsim. Each one is pulling in his direction. And today, Amir Hashem, will talk about other members of the household. You could have children who are older, children who are younger. We're going to talk about two shutfim, two partners that own an Eved, and we'll differentiate between Eved Knani and Eved Ivri. We'll talk about Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin. These are some of the issues that we want to address today. Tana Rabbana, we learned in a Bryce. Again, we'll read the entire pasuk in Parshas Bo. It says, "Ish sel lebeis avos, sel abayis," and the pasuk seems to indicate that there's an ish. That ish is the balabayis. He's in charge. He's the commander in chief, and he will shech the Pesach on behalf of the members labayis. Now, ish sel lebeis avos. That ish who's the balabayis. Selabayis, he will take the seh and he will be makriv, he'll slaughter the seh or have the Kohen slaughter the seh on behalf of the members of the household of the bayis. Olamni, the Brisa says, derived from this, Sha'adam mevi v'shochet. Now, here you have the words al yidei. I found that a little bit confusing for me because al yidei means through, but that's not what it means here. It means on behalf of, not through somebody, but on behalf of somebody. And if I were you, I would cross out the words al yidei, and instead I would write the word avur. Avur, ayin beis vav reish, means on behalf of. So Adam mevi v'shochet al yidei b'no ubito haktanim. So the first category of what I call the balabayit and his authority vested in him to be makriv the korban on behalf of someone is b'no ubito aktanim, banov ubito ubnosov aktanim, and they are children who are less than bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. And we've said on many occasions that it is the father who bears the responsibility vis-a-vis the religious activities, the training, the chinuch of his young children. And we can also add a financial element into the equation. It's called samuch al shulchan aviyah. Right? For example, the Gemara Bava Metzia says that if a son or a daughter that are less than bar mitzvah find a lost object and it's hefker, there's no simon, there's yeuch, etc., they pick it up and the ownership automatically accrues to the father. Why? Because there's samach al shulchan avir. It means that he, the father, supports them, and therefore he is in charge of their activities, and in this case of their achilas hapesach. Not to be confused with a somewhat similar halacha, it sounds similar, of Ner Chanukah, where he will light Ner Chanukah on behalf of his children. That's a different concept. That's not a matter of chinuch, of training the children. It's a matter of pirsum hanes. And this has to do with what's called Hidur mitzvah. In Ner Chanukah, as you know very well, Hidur mitzvah plays the major role. And the Hidur mitzvah is that the candles, the number of candles in the window of the house, well, Pesach Beis Bachutz in the original takana, should reflect how many people experience the miracle of defeating the Yevonim. And every single member of that household, no matter how young he or she may be, was in the Hatzalah, and therefore the Neros should reflect that Hatzalah. But again, the Mishnah, the Brisa says in Ner Chanukah, Ner Ish Ubeso, the same Ish that we're focusing on here in the pasuk of Ish Sela Bayis. In Ner Chanukah, it's Ish Ner Lebeso. Now, we haven't yet gotten to the main question here for today, and that's Eved or Shivcha. The man owns an Eved. Is he considered the Balabayas, meaning the Eved is part of Besa? We find this, for example, in the Sugya in Yevamos about Mila. And it dates back to the time of Avram Avinu when he got the mitzvah of Mila. And he's in charge and responsible for the Mila of his Avodim. We see that Avodim are also considered Besa. When I say Avodim, I mean Eved or Shivcha. And we're talking specifically about an Eved Knani, who's, what word can I use? He's in the domain, if I could use that word, of his Adon. And any monetary acquisitions of the Eved automatically revert into the bank account of the Adon. And that's called Kana Eved, Kana Rav. So certainly the Rav, the Adon, the master of the Eved, insofar as he owns the Eved, by the way, that's not a moral category. It doesn't mean he doesn't have to treat the Eved properly. He treats them like cattle. He should treat his cattle properly also. I mean, Sar Balichaim. But certainly in the case of an Eved, he has to treat him royally on a moral level. But on a legal level, the Eved is Kanu L'Rabo, and therefore the Rav becomes the Balabayas of his household, and the bias includes his Avodim. And what that means is it's irrelevant what the age of the Eved is. The Eved may be 95 years old and he's very wise, but nevertheless, he is considered Beso of the Adon, who might be a young whippersnapper and he's a 13-year-old boy. It's irrelevant. Age is not a factor here. In the case of Banov and Benosov, age becomes a critical factor. Because once the children reach a certain age, they are independent of their father. The father is not chayav, he's not obligated vis-a-vis them in training them and in chinuch. And therefore, we're going to emphasize banov u'bnosav haktanim, or ben u'bito haktanim. But in the case of Eved v'shivcha, age is not a factor. And the Eved is kanui to his adon. And that kinyan, which has tremendous repercussions in Choshen Mishpat and monetary law, has repercussions in the law of Korban Pesach as far as setting up a Korban and a Chabura. And the Balabayas is in charge of his Avodah as far as the Korban Pesach is concerned. The Eved has no say in the matter. We're not going to ask the Eved, where do you want to eat the Korban Pesach? You want to eat it with Yankel Beryl on 9th Street or with Cyril Rochel on 11th Avenue? No. The decision and the authority is totally exclusively in the hands of the Adon. He is called the Balabayas. He's the Ish of Celebasa. And therefore the Brisa says, Bein midaiton ubein shalom midaiton. Again, life is going to get complicated when we have two partners who share ownership over the same Evet. But now we're talking about a case where there's one owner has exclusive ownership over the Evet, and Bein midaiton, Bein shalom midaiton. Again, when the Brisa says midaiton, as if to say that they approve, what exactly is the Brisa saying? Because I don't need to know midaiton. You haven't added anything by telling me midaiton. I would say that the phrase midaiton is just part of a twin phrase of bein midaiton, bein shalom midaiton. I don't think there's any chiddush here in midaiton. I'm just looking here in the notes. He says that we'll have to wait until the maskana of this sugya until we really appreciate the word midaiton. And that has to do with bno bito aktanim. Okay, so I'm not going to jump ahead of myself. I just want to get through this brisa first and foremost. Now here he says, and you can look in Rashi di Rascal Al. He summarizes Rashi. He says, "Kishe'ena rotzim limanos olav." They're not interested in being part of this particular Korban Pesach. Irrelevant. Kevan sha'olav. It's on his shoulders. This ish, the balabayis. Mutal lechanech es banav haktanim. Since there's a chiyuv chinuch, and we have to know whether that's the Raisa or the Rabbanon, harei heim nechshavim b'nei beisa. So in this case, it's not the monetary authority or control he has over his young children that makes him into the balabayis and them into b'nei beisa, but rather it's the mitzvah of chinuch. And probably what he means is that now we're dealing with the question of the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, and the mitzvah of Korban Pesach comes under the general rubric of chinuch, to be mechanic the child. Now, the Ramban is bothered by this. He says, what do you mean by chinuch? Rashi speaks about chinuch. We're talking about a bas, not just a ben. And there's a whole sugya nazir about the mitzvah of chinuch. Interesting, of all places in Chas, I mean, there's a little bit in brachas, but the main address for the mitzvah of chinuch is Masechet Nazir Chavtes. That's where the Gemara talked about whether a father could train or should train his son to be a Nazir. And in that sugya, Reish Lakish is quoted as saying, Ein ha'av mechuyev b'chinuch bito. Maybe that's the mother's obligation. I don't know. We'd have to see the sugya in Nazir. But the Ramban is bothered by this. He's saying that, although again it's Reish Lakish there, but it seems that everyone agrees to Reish Lakish that a father is not obligated in the chinuch of his daughter. So what does Rashi mean here when he proposes that the reason why the father is in charge of the Korban Pesach of his daughter, right, who's less than 12, is because of the chinuch element? What do you mean chinuch? There is no chiyuv chinuch vis-a-vis a daughter. And that's Ramban's kash. Now, I have a germ of an idea to reinterpret this Rashi. Rashi is about 15 lines down from the top of the Amud. And he says, more like 10 lines. He says, Shebno ubito aktanim olav lechancha. I mean, Rashi is about as clear as a whistle. Olav lechancha, he's talking about bno ubito. As I state, you can't deny that. I mean, is Rashi oblivious to the Gemara in Nazir that says that Ein Av Mechuyev lechanich as bito? He says, ubito aktanim olav lechancha. Olav means he's obligated. I'm tempted, again, I don't know if you have to hear this because it's just musings of a madman here, but I'm tempted to think that there are two categories of chinuch. One is chinuch le-mitzvah, and the other is chinuch le-kedusha. Let me try to explain. What is the obligation of a parent vis-a-vis a child in halachic terms? And there are two answers to this question, and they're both correct. One is more general, and the other is specific. When I say general, I mean all-encompassing. It's not limited to mitzvos. It could apply to kedusha as well. For example, Chazal say, it's actually in this week's parsha, it says, Kadish atzmecha b'mutar lecha, Chazal say, that a Jew has to surround himself and be inspired by an atmosphere of that's conducive to kedusha. We are called Mamleches Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh in this coming parsha. Then there's a much more specific, honed-in chiyuv of chinuch, which is generated by every single mitzvah in and of itself. And the sugya Nazir is addressing the issue not of chinuch le-mitzvah as a specific obligation that's generated by each mitzvah individually, but rather chinuch le-kedusha. So, for example, chinuch le-mitzvah would not necessarily apply, I would say almost definitely would not apply, when there's no chiyuv and there's no obligation. No one has to become a nazir. Who commanded you to become a nazir? You took it upon yourself to be a nazir. Now you're obligated in many, many different mitzvot and enjoined from many isurim, but nobody forced you to become a nazir. So do I have to train my child to become a nazir? The answer is it depends. If you're talking from the specific perspective of each mitzvah, the mitzvah of nazir is not included in chinuch. I don't have to be mechanech my child to accept upon himself nazirus, because nazirus is a higher level of kedusha, but it's not obligatory. So it's not a mitzvah that I have to train you in because you're going to become a gadol and you should be mekayim that mitzvah. It's not like, Shabbos and kashrus and a lulav and shofar and esrog. I have to be mechanech my child because he will be included in that mitzvah. The issue of nazir vis-a-vis chinuch is a different kind of chinuch. That's the general chinuch l'kedusha. And if, for whatever reason, Kadish atzmecha b'mutar lecha applies and is fulfilled through nazirus, whatever the situation warrants it, then I have a chiyuv of chinuch l'kedusha, for the sanctity that my son should strive for. But I don't have that obligation vis-a-vis my daughter. Could be that my wife, the mother of this girl, has the obligation. She's obligated in the chinuch l'kedusha of the daughter. Our sugya is dealing with chinuch l'mitzvah. And in the case of chinuch l'mitzvah, it's the father who's obligated. And right now exclusively the father. Again, in a fallback position, we may invite the mother into the equation. But right now, we have a Baruch Hashem, we have a father who's psychologically and biologically healthy. He's obligated to train his children, whether it's his boys or his girls, in the mitzvahs that they are obligated or will become obligated. And that's true even according to Reish Lakish. When Reish Lakish makes the statement that Ein ha'av mechuyev lechanech es bito, he's talking about chinuch l'kedusha. And we split between the mother and the father. The father takes over the chinuch l'kedusha of his male children, and the mother of the female children. And that's the sugya nazi. Our sugya is not talking about this generic, all-inclusive chinuch l'kedusha, to imitate God and strive for more dvekus and spiritual and morality and so forth. So that's the sugya nazi. Our sugya is the mitzvah of chinuch vis-a-vis the mitzvos, and here in our case, we're honing in on the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. And here, the Torah obligated the father in chinuch, as Rashi says, both vis-a-vis the sons and the daughters. Again, do you have to hear this? I don't know. It's a question of how you zoom in on Zoom, if you follow me. If you want to hear, some of my crazy ideas, I'm just trying to defend Rashi, because on the face of it, Rashi's saying exactly the opposite of a Gemara Nazir. And you can't play around with Rashi's words over here. But maybe there are two categories of chinuch and two sugyas. What else? So now, in the case of Banav Ubito Haktanim, the Brisa says, Bein Midaita, Bein Shalom Midaita. The father is in the driver's seat. They are B'nai Beso, and he doesn't need their approval. They don't have veto power to say, no, we don't like this Korban Pesach, we want to eat that Korban Pesach. The same thing now applies if we're dealing with the definition of B'nai Beso, to Avadav, Vishivchosov, Haknanim, they are also called B'nai Beso. And if that be the case, they don't have a choice in the matter. He will make that decision, that call, as to which Korban Pesach they can eat from and which Chabur they are part of. And the reason why they are called B'nai Beso is not the same reason that we gave in the case of Banav Ubito Ktanim. You might read this price and think it's all Miksha Achas. It's not. In the case of Avodim, it's a whole different approach. We're not talking about chinuch. I don't have to be machanech my Eved Knani. He's an independent agent, and he has to fulfill his obligations. I'm not in charge of his piety and his religious behavior, but I am in charge of his monetary possessions. And that gives me the status of the Balabayas. He is now from the B'nai Beisa. Therefore, the Eved, the Shivcha, has no say in the matter. It will be totally in the purview, in the territory of the Adon, of the Rav. He will determine where and from which korban they will eat. That's the ratio of this price. Now we get to the Sefer. Aval eno shochet al yedei b'no. Again, al yedei means avur, on behalf of b'no ubita gdolim. He has no obligation of chinuch. Once his child, that's what we call bar shefterani, the child became bar or bat mitzvah, they're on their own. V'lo al yedei avdo v'shivcho. What does that mean? Ha'ivriim. We're talking about a Jewish Eved. He's not really an Eved. He's basically working on behalf of his Adon, and we'll have sugyas in Masechet Kedushin, what kind of work he has to do. It's not gufo kanui. The Adon doesn't own the Eved is an independent Yad. If he finds an Aveda, he can pocket it for himself. He doesn't have to give it to the Adon. And therefore, he is financially independent of the Adon. And this independence generates a responsibility on his behalf, in the case of an Eved Ivri, to go out and decide where he's going to join a Chabur to eat the Korban Pesach. Now, what happens when you read this brisa in the case of an Eved Ivri, and it's more relevant to what we call an Amavriya, which is the female Jewish shivcha, is called an Amavriya. If they're ktanim. Now, in the case of Eved Ivri, I'm not sure, I have to double check this, if there's a possibility of an Eved Ivri who is a katan. You have to know more about inheritance laws. Okay, I'll get back to you. But in the case of a bas, who's an Amavriya, as long as she's a ketana, the father has the ability to sell her as an Amavriya. So we're talking about a shivcha ivris, ketana. And the truth is that in a Jewish girl, she can only be a shivcha if she's a ketana, because otherwise she's yotzeis b'simonim. Those who were with me for the third parak of Ksubis maybe recall, on I think it was on Daf Chav Tes at the very beginning of Elu Naris, we discussed the fact that Gadlus and Shifchus are mutually exclusive. You can't have an Amavriya who's already a Gdola. So we must be talking here, in the case of a Shifcha Ivris, and it says explicitly, they avdov Shifcha Ivris, we're talking about a Ketana. Now, this is really odd, because a Ketana, like we spoke about earlier in the case of Banov who bita Ketanim, is not an independent agent in halacha. And yet, our Brisa says that you have this Ketana, she's a Shivcha, she's called an Amavriya, and she will decide for herself which Korban Pesach she'll be part of. And this, I think, touches a little bit on what we discussed yesterday in the case of a Yasam. And he has two apotropsim, each one respectively announced that we're assigning our Yasam to this korban, that korban, and at the end of the day, the Yasam will decide which korban he wants to be part of. And that's again a kata. And the impression I'm getting here, and it's pretty radical chiddush, is that although in Kol HaTorah Kula, a katan is considered a la bardas, he doesn't have a status of a yad, he can't create a chalos, but with regard to Korban Pesach, as a cheftzah mitzvah, he is considered like a bardas. Again, if it's a case of chinuch, of a father vis-a-vis his biological children, they don't have any say whatsoever. He's the balabas. But in a case of an ivriya who is serving another Jew as an omavriya, because her father sold her and she's a ketana, in that case, there's no mitzvah of chinuch on the purchaser of this shivcha. She's doing work for him, but he doesn't have any obligation to make sure that she reads Seder on Shabbos, and she fulfills the mitzvahs. There's no chinuch. Now, oddly enough, even as a ketana, she will decide where she wants to eat the Korban Pesach. V'lo yidei ishta. And the same thing is true in the case of a husband vis-a-vis his wife. She's an independent agent. She will decide ultimately where she wants to eat the Korban Pesach. The husband can offer to register on her behalf, but ultimately the decision is in her hands. Elami Daiton. Now, Rabbo say, what does the word midaiton mean over here? Let me give you two possibilities. Either midaiton means you have to sign on the dotted line. Now, here's a document that says you are, I'm just inventing this for pedagogical purposes. Here's a document that says you are here. The other side have committed themselves to join our chabura. So midaiton means you have to sign on the dotted line. Or the word midaiton here might mean that they have rights to veto power, but they don't have to actually sign on to the Korban Pesach. If a husband joins a chabura on his own behalf and on behalf of his wife, that is a valid minui, in which case his wife is part of that minui. She doesn't have to sign anything, but she does have veto power, so that when he signs her up for that chabura, it's conditional on her approval. If she disagrees, if she vetoes it, this is not the Korban Pesach I want to eat out of, she's not part of the meeting. Tanya Idach, we have another brayso. Lo yishchad adam lo al yidei bno ubita gedolim. So here the brayso switches the order around and starts with the limitation, which means when he doesn't have the status of ish for the bnei beis. So that's the case of banav ubita gedolim. Lo yidei avdov shivchatza ivrim. Lo yidei ish lo el midaiton. Whatever that word midaiton means. Avol shokin hu al yidei bno ubita ktanim al yidei avdov shivchatza knanim. Bein midaiton bein shalom midait v'kulan. All that were listed in this price is sheshachatu v'shachat rabban aleihem. Let's say they went ahead and they joined on their own volition a particular chabura, and the owner of this eved went ahead and he signed them up on a different chabura. Is yotzin b'shal rabban v'ein yotzin b'shal atzman. They can only fulfill the Korban Pesach with the chabur that was designated assigned by the adon, by the rabban. Chutz min ha'isha. Isha here is a category. You know, it's not a specific case of an isha. It means anyone like an isha who has their own status of independence. She yachola limchus, and she has the right to veto, and I don't want to be part of this chabur. Let me add a few notes over here, a few comments here. A yasam who's a katan is considered vis-a-vis the apotropos as b'nei beso, and the question of celibayis, is it a doraisa or is it a drabanan? This is actually a machlokes between Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi assumes that the Torah was machadish this on a doraisa level. A person cannot be registered on a Pesach against his will, and yet a person could register his bnei beso against their will. And obviously Rashi is dealing with the doraisa. Tosfos Dibur Maskil said, in a very short comment, says that celibayis lavda oraisa, and they understood that which Reb Zera said, that a person could appoint his, let's say in the case of an apotropos, a yasam katan al Pesach, and even shalom midaito, and in that sense it's like a katan who has to have a minui on the Pesach. This whole din is only the rabbanon on a deraisa level. the Ketanim could eat from the Pesach, and not only that, Tosfos implies they don't even need minui. And this is based on a sugya in Nidarim Daf Lamed Vav. Amar Abseira, Shisha lebeis avos lav da oraisa, biyosam katan sheshachtu olav shnei apotropsim, ikilu chachamim sheyachol lechol min haPesach. And it sounds like this entire din of a yosam is not really midin minui, and the yosam as a katan is allowed to eat from the korban pesach even without minui, and that's called shisha lebayis, shisha lebeis avos lav d'oraisa. According to Tosfos, what Reb Zera says in Nidarim, shisha lebayis ain't d'oraisa means midoraisa katan yochel lechol me'apesach below minui. And this is a discussion in Reb Chaim in Hilchos Korban Pesach Parakeh. So then if we take this machlokes and we apply it here to our sugya that we learned today, let's just read it again. The Brisa says, where is it? Just one second. Yeah, it says, Adam mevi v'shochet al yidei bito b'no bito aktanim bein midaiton bein shalom midaiton, that he has the control and the authority, exclusive authority, over them, the b'no bito aktanim as b'nei beso, to determine whether they like it or not, where they'll eat the Korban Pesach. And according to Rashi, the drush of Selabayis, which is the subject and the source of this brisa, is doraisa. So this halacha that a father could be mamana his child on this Korban Pesach, that's a doraisa halacha. But Tosfos says that it's only derabbanan. Now it's not so simple here, because if this din is only derabbanan, then how could the eved and the shivcha, in the case of a Knani, how could they eat from the Korban Pesach, which is against their will? In other words, the Adon, the Rav, assigned them to a Korban Pesach, registered them against their will. And on a Doraisa level, according to Tosfos, there's not even money on the Pesach, which would mean that this Pesach is now Nechal Shalol Nuyav, and a Pesach Shalol Nuyav is possible. So Reb Chaim says the following: perhaps even with regard to B'no Bito Aktanim, Reb Zera meant that Midaraisa, you cannot be mamana them on the Pesach against their will. But with regard to Eved v'Shivchaso, Midaraisa, he could be mamana them against their will. Now we have a note here in the name of the Sfas Emes, a kasha of the Sfas Emes. He says, Afshe ein tzorches das hayosam. We don't need the agreement of the yosam in order to be memane him. Mikol makom harei efshar li monos al shnei psachim ki echad. That's a Gemara later on. So you cannot be registered for two different chaburis at the same time. We came to Shneim Nu al Pesach in the case of the Apotropsim, where both of them had assigned each one respectively on his Korban Pesach. He has to somehow remove himself, this yasam, from one of the two psachim. He can't be registered on both. Is imkein adayin tzarich l'bin breira. Once again, don't we need the decision of the yasam as to which pesach he wants to part of? That's going to come later, and it's going to be chal retroactively through the operation of breira. Says the Sfas Emes, yesh lomar shel hashem kach ein tzarich l'bin breira v'day b'meshu megales daito v'yachar shchita she'ein ritzono limanis ima. He doesn't flesh it out for us exactly why that's so. Okay, then. So this is where we're going to stop for today, and I wish you a great